Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to what is probably going to be a very beautiful, at times painful, at times hopeful, harrowing conversation. I can't tell you how honored I am to be seated, to have the opportunity to speak to two titans of African thought. So thank you for joining us for the first day of the festival. I like opening up chats with like a deep breath generally as like a deeply human and acknowledgement of big feelings. So I hope that you can join me in taking 3 deep breaths just to ground us into the space and also just like get you into your body. So if you can, give yourself a little bit of a shake, if you can. And a deep breath in and out. One more. And out. One more, just for good measure. And out. Okay, welcome. So I thought that I'd start with the formal stuff, with introductions and bios, and to introduce our 2 fantastic speakers. I am a true millennial, so between this conversation, I'm going to be moving through written notes, as well as my phone and the beautiful power of the internet, which I deeply respect. So I'll start with Professor Adekeye Adebajo. Professor Adekeye Adebajo is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He was the director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg between 2017 and 2021, and was executive director of the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town between 2003 and 2016. Professor Adebajo served on United Nations missions in South Africa, Western Sahara, and Iraq, and was director of the Africa program at the International Peace Institute in New York. He is the author of 8 books, including Building Peace in West Africa, UN Peacekeeping in Africa, and Boutros Ghali, Afro-Arab Prophet, Pharaoh, and Pope. He is co-editor and editor of 10 books on Africa's international relations, including From Global Apartheid to Global Village, Africa and United Nations. He's a graduate of the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Massachusetts in the United States. He obtained his doctorate from Oxford University in England. Please, please join me in welcoming our professor, please. I have the honor also of introducing Bibi Bakare-Yusuf. Bibi Bakare-Yusuf is co-founder and publishing director of one of Africa's leading publishing houses, Cassava Republic Press. She's worked as a gender and research consultant in the public, private, and development sectors for the BBC, UN Fem, Action Aid, eShekels, Central Bank of Nigeria, the European Union, and others. She co-founded Tapestry Consulting, a boutique research and training company focused on gender, sexuality, and transformational issues in Nigeria. She has a PhD in Women and Gender Studies from the University of Warwick. She has published many academic papers and regularly presents papers at academic conferences. She sits on the editorial board of a number of influential journals, and Dr. Bibi is also a Yale World Fellow, a Desmond Tutu Fellow, and a Frankfurt Book Fair Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bibi. Okay, so just like moving us straight into, I am holding a mammoth book with many contributors, but that was edited by our professor, called The Black Atlantic's Triple Burden: Slavery, Colonialism, and Reparations. And as a structuring sort of principle for this chat, we're going to be moving through slavery as a grounding principle to think through, colonialism and reparations to think about the future. But before we even get into that, I think we need clarifications of terms. And I thought that a really interesting entryway into both of your works and perspectives on contemporary and historical issues affecting Africans in the diaspora. I thought that I'd ask you on very specific terms and what they mean in your work. Professor, you use two specific terms that I think are so expansive but are so incredibly influential. You use the terms global Africa and Black Atlantic. And I thought that it would be a good place to start to ask, what do you mean by both of those terms and how do they feature in your work?
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. I think the term Black Atlantic was popularized by Paul Gilroy, the Guyanese-British scholar who wrote the seminal book in 1993 called The Black Atlantic. And the way that Paul Gilroy defined the Black Atlantic was the creation of a new culture that was dynamic and adding to global civilization. He saw it as something that emerged obviously from slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and the African diaspora that was created as a result of it in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and in Europe. And he used often the symbolism of ships to describe the Black Atlantic. Global Africa is a term that is associated most, I think, with the Kenyan intellectual Ali Mazrui, who did a wonderful 9-part series in 1986 called The Africans. And Mazrui saw global Africa basically as an African diaspora also, but defined it in terms of geography and movement. So he looked at the different continents where, Europe, the ones I've just said, Europe, North America, South America, but also the Indian Black Ocean that has enjoyed less attention. And he then also defined global Africa in terms of a newer diaspora, mostly based in Europe and also in America. So there are probably about 10.6 million Africans living in the diaspora. Many of them are living in Europe. I think there are about 4 million in France and Britain alone. In America, there are about 2.4 million of what Ali Mazrui called, rather than African Americans, American Africans. So lots of Africans that have migrated to, lots of Africans rather, that have migrated to the US and now become American. And you can see many of them in literature, in policy spaces. I think even the Surgeon General, who is creating a lot of waves in Florida, seems to be from Nigeria himself. So, and the American diaspora is important, of course, because it's doubled every year between 1970 and about 2020, and is now about 2.4 million. Many of them are Nigerians, Ghanaians, and Ethiopians. And you can see the cultural influence also of that. So that's how I would kind of distinguish or interpret global Africa and the Black Atlantic.
Thank you for that. Paul Gilroy's work is I encountered in university, and it's beautiful to kind of see the uniting potential of something as large, and I love the term global Africa, I love the term Black Atlantic, though they are grief-laden terms. So thank you so much for elucidating. Dr. Bibi, your work, at least the way that I encounter it, from the direction of thinking through gender and sexuality, and a lot of your work deals with the body and thinks about the body as a site of thought, as an archive in itself. And I wanted to ask you about two specific terms that crop up a lot in your work, but specifically what you term the body of knowledge and the body of labor, and the distinctions that you make between the two. Could you introduce us to a little bit about what you mean?
Thank you so much. It's interesting that two Nigerians on this panel talking about blackness and Black Atlantic, global African, when your countrywoman or Southern African woman, Panache Chugumadze, reminded us in an essay called "Why I'm No Longer Talking to Nigerians About Race." And here we are, two Nigerians talking about race. So maybe we did hear her voice. When I was thinking through the idea of bodies of knowledge and bodies of labor, they're quite intertwined, and they are intertwined because as Black bodies, literally our physicality, the materiality of our being, it is what has been the engine of industrial revolution, the engine of capitalist production, whether we like it or not, and also the body of scientific knowledge as well. So I often think the body of knowledge and the body of labor, whether it's labor in the field of cutting, of powering industrialization, and today we have the AI revolution. Once again, our bodies continues to be the extractive machinery that powers where oil, palm oil, cotton, all of those extractions powered a particular period. And today, our bodies continue. So we have body of labor that is powering the world. So Black bodies, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, continues to be the thing that powers, that produces not just capital, it produces capital and reproduces capital as well. So that's one side. But also, our bodies is also the site of knowledge production. Our bodies are used for scientific knowledge. So when we think of Henrietta Lacks, we think of Sarah Batman from here, you continue to see how bodies are constantly being used and manipulated and reworked. But also, that's if you think of it in terms of the imposition of power. But then when we think about ourselves, when we do see ourselves as producing knowledge, we're producing culture, whether it's through performances, dance, reproduction of ideas. And if you think about the book you're holding, there's a physicality to a book, but then there's also brains and bones that have come together to produce that. And I'm always really interested in reminding us and reminding myself that we are not just thinking being. We're not that Cartesian, extrapolated away from the mind or from the body, that we are always incarnated minds. We can't begin to make a distinction between the two. And when we think about how we enter into the world, into the modern world systems as Africans, we come in as people. I always say people don't question our ability to sing or our ability to dance. What is being questioned is our ability to reason, whether we have logos. And we're always straddling between this question of logos, of knowledge production. And this is why, whether we're thinking of Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, Ali Mazuri's Global African, these are black men or African men, men of African descent, who are trying to wrestle with that very question of knowledge production. How do we embody knowledge and how do we reproduce that? Mm-hmm. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. It's brilliant also that you bring in the names of black women like Sarah Bartman, as well as
Lacks.
And Henrietta Lacks, whose healer cells have set the stage for decades and decades and decades and decades of scientific research and breakthrough, and it took great struggles for Henrietta's descendants to be recognized as human and for her contributions, which I'm sure was a very painful process. I really want to kind of get into the text of such and to kind of think through the nitty-gritty of slavery. And I would love to read from this fantastic introduction that you've read, Professor Adebayo, about the triple burden. But in a section about the transatlantic slave trade, you begin, slavery was undoubtedly Europe's original sin against Africa. European locusts, explorers, savers, merchants, missionaries, imperialists, arrived in Africa in the 15th century and for the next 5 centuries ravaged the continent. The Portuguese were transporting enslaved Africans to Cape Verde and the Madeira Islands by the 1480s, while Spanish conquistadors shipped Africans to the Caribbean from 1502. In the process, they spread destructive plague and pestilence. As with biblical locusts, the agricultural sector in which most Africans found employment was destroyed. Famines proliferated, and the greatest migration in human history was enforced, with enchained human cargo being transported to the Caribbean and the Americas as chattel in totally degrading circumstances. I wanted to ask about the specter of the Middle Passage that I think features in both of your work in interesting ways. But I think it's very difficult to begin with pain, but I think perhaps let's start there. Could you speak a little bit about the Middle Passage, about how early European slavery and the transatlantic slavery started? Because from reading your introduction, I was shocked many times to find out how old this institution truly is and how many African lives were lost in this Middle Passage.
I mean, I think I'd like to start on a more personal note in the sense that I'm a scholar of international relations, not history. The book itself, as we were discussing just before we started, is very interdisciplinary. So there are lots of historians and literature people and even people that are linguists and sociologists and economists and people like that. And as you saw, even though we tried to make sure we had a core of Afro-Caribbean scholars, we also wanted to have French, German, and other scholars who had spent their lives studying this. Part of what motivated me to do the project was, while I was studying international relations in both the US and Britain, I never learned anything about either slavery or colonialism. And we hardly ever read literature by African or Caribbean or other scholars. I mean, Ali Mazrui, I had to discover myself. He was nowhere near my syllabus. You know, even people like Edward Said and others. And so it was so shocking for me, first when I did my 2010 book on the curse of Berlin, which was looking mostly at colonialism's legacy on Africa, and that was a single-authored book. But then I thought it was important also to look at slavery and link it to colonialism, because those continuities are obviously there. And in 2020, we did another book based on a conference in 2017 called the Pan-African Pantheon, which looked at about 38 Pan-African figures, the pioneers like Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey, and others, and we looked at writers and we looked at philosophers. We made it very broad, Maya Angelou and others. And I thought it was important to now try to link the two and also link it to the issue of reparations, because at that conference at the University of Johannesburg in 2017, the keynote speaker is the current chair of the Caribbean Commission for Reparations and the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Sir Hilary Beckles. And he gave an amazing keynote address on the issue of reparations, which convinced me for the first time that this is a struggle that we clearly need to become part of as a strong movement. But what I found was a lot of the activism was not necessarily based on very solid scholarship, And so that's what we've tried to provide the evidence for activists to be able to take that forward. The story of the Middle Passage, 12 to 15 million Africans in their prime, 15 to 35 years old, were basically shipped in the most degrading circumstances across the Atlantic over a period of 4 centuries, more or less between 1480 and 1888. And these were some of the most productive people in terms of what they were doing in their societies. And a lot of this, the countries involved, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, for centuries profited from this trade, and it clearly benefited the West's industrialization. Not many deny that now. And Eric Williams' classic book, the Trinidadian scholar-politician, Capitalism and Slavery, very clearly showed that in the British context, how much Britain had benefited as a result of this. But for Africa itself and its descendants, obviously, we're still living with the legacy and impacts of that today, in terms of, for example, when you saw during COVID, even though African Americans are only 14% of the population, they were dying at 2 times the rates of other races as a result of some of the structural damage of 250 years of American slavery. Likewise, you see similar things in the Caribbean in terms of some of the health issues from the sugary drinks and the kind of working slaves to death and the inequalities that were created as a result of those structural issues as well. And 40% of these slaves went to Cuba and Brazil, incredibly, even though we tend to focus a lot on the US itself. Brazil has one of the largest population of people that are descended from Africa in the world. It would probably be about 3rd or 4th largest population, but they're heavily discriminated against, living in favelas, in poor ghettos like African Americans are. Only recently did you even have any kind of educational affirmative action programs. So for me, the most important thing were the continuities of slavery. We haven't I know we'll get to colonialism, But that was the most important thing for me, just to look at the impact. I recently wrote a book on African security after the Cold War. And, you know, typically in international relations scholarship, they would identify the root causes of African conflicts in, like, you know, bad governance and military rule and things like that. But a friend of mine pushed me, a Canadian friend, why don't you actually look at some of the structural issues you've been studying? You know, you can't separate the formation of the African state system and the damage that the transatlantic slave trade did from what is going on today. So I think that's the most important thing in terms of this issue.
Absolutely. And hearing also about the curse of Berlin and the impact of the continent being carved up, but we'll get to that when we get to colonialism. But I really appreciate the ways in which you collapse the siloization of thinking about history and thinking about political realities and futures and what we're left with by smoothing thought through slavery and into colonialism. Dr. Bibi, in thinking about the middle passage and how it sort of crops up and pops up in your work, I was thinking about your thoughts on the archive and your work with Cassava Press in general, and your remarks just now about the labor that it takes, just that the book is not just an object of, it's an object of labor, it's a system of thought, it's a body in itself. And I wanted to read some of your remarks on the archive as a reservoir, and then ask you a little bit about that. In your speech, Archival Fever, that you presented at Abantu, you say, the archive as a reservoir of and for memory is the place where ideas and material culture of historic interest or social relevance are stored and ordered. It is where society warehouses what it wants to remember and what it sees as worthy of remembrance, especially for the future. Whether that archive is of literature, music, visual art, film, plastic art, buildings, I'm interested in what future people will find that gives them a record, a sense of this present moment. In thinking about slavery, that so much of what we know is pieced, is fragmented, because the historical archive in itself is also complicated by legacies of colonialism and also the university system, which in itself, when we think about the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the Fallist movement and this really important 10-year anniversary that so many of us are celebrating at the moment, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the archive as a troubled and troubling place, and your work with Cassava Press and how you hook that up, how that connects.
Thank you. I just also want to say, before I talk about the archive, to say that we're here in Cape Town. This is a site of slavery. It's not, slavery is not some faraway place. And part of what we see in South Africa, as an example, which is one of the most unequal society, is we are still experiencing the afterlife of slavery in this society. And it's not just in South Africa where you have a settler colony. In West Africa, where we have more of an indirect colonization, the afterlife of slavery permeates every single society on the continent. We are touched by that afterlife of slavery, or what people would call post-colonialism for us. But in fact, it is still, we are all working through, working against the history of slavery and its afterlife, as Saidiya Hartman talks about. And I think this becomes important when we think about the archive, because the archive is a troubling place. It is not neutral. It is riddled with violence, as well as possibilities as well. the archive is something that I think it's important. The archive is both, we go into an archive, we say we're going into an archive. That means that we are physically, our bodies are moving through space and in place. So the archive is both spatial and temporal, right? So we kind of have to think in that way. But also the archive, because it's a temporal entity, it means that it's always in the present as well. And I'm always thinking about how we create the archive. Whatever we do now is what's going to become the archive in the future. If we don't create something, we're just going to get locked in that Hegelian idea that Africa has no history. And this is where publishing becomes really important. Like I said earlier, nobody questions whether we can sing or whether we can dance. It is whether we can think, and right? Whether we can think and reason. The book is a physical manifestation of logos. And so we have to take it seriously as a people. The work that we have here that you're holding, the Black Atlantic Triple Burden, is an important text. It's both a living, material, and archival entity, right? And we have to read, work with it, fight against it as well, because there will be things in there that will be contested. As every good archive should be, it should be contestable, and we could go there and we build and we work. At least we will not be starting from a blank sheet of paper. Often, for us as Black people, we're always being asked to look at the future, to project into the future. We're the only society that's been asked to look forward. Because for us to look back, it's too dangerous. Because if we were to look back and truly go into history, which is what this book is demanding of us, I'm surprised that we haven't imploded and we haven't blown up the world, right? This is why we have to keep asking us to go into the future. But yet, we are dealing with Europe, for example, a nation of ancestor worshippers. Yet we are told that we are the ancestor worshippers. Every single thing, the whole entire European political systems, their philosophical worldview is always referring back to ancient Greece, the past, the past, the past, the past. And yet, Africa's young youth, they're the future. Let's look at it. And we have to really think about the whole concept of the Sankofa. I think Panashe Chugmaze, and I'm really going to cite her here because she talked about the Sankofa dialectics, that we have to be always operating from both the past, the present, and the future, because the African temporality demands that of us. And so for me at Cassava Republic exists both as an archival machine as well as an entity for us to consume information, to consume knowledge, to consume pleasure as well, right? To read books just for the fun of it, just because it's there. And I think that as Black people, and I'm saying Black people deliberately because I'm on this soil. This is a slave soil, so I want to really own that term Blackness. And I'm putting aside the word African just for this space. We need to take ourselves seriously. We need to take ideas seriously. We need to take our everyday action and put them under scrutiny and elevate them as worthy of interrogation and document. Yes, people can say, yes, we have our oral tradition, we have our music, we have our theater, we have our performances that embodies all our knowledge and ideas. but we have the gift of the text now. And now I'm going to go back to Africa. As true Africans, we are always borrowing, right? We're always working through time, working through things that are available to us. And the gift of the text is with us, right? So we must use it. And Cassava Republic, in a way, is an offering for us to take up that space and produce archive for the future, for now, so that another Hegel will not wake up and say, we do not have a history, and a young Nigerian or a young Panache Chugumadzi will not tell us that Nigerians don't talk about race, right?
Yeah.
That we will not be saying, oh, we only discover race when we went to America, when in fact, whether you like it, whether you're in Nigeria, or Lagos, or Johannesburg, race is with us. It's circulating. Some of us are more conscious of it, and some of us are less conscious of it.
Thank you for that. Speaking about the gift of the text, it's really beautiful also to encounter all of the different texts in this giant volume. But sticking with the introduction and moving into colonialism, a text that you cite a lot is Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I think I want to read from the text and then ask you a little bit from that. So in the section you say, colonialism, how Europe underdeveloped and brutalized Africa. The link between slavery and colonialism is inextricable. As the Nigerian historian Jacob Adekeye noted, the transatlantic slave trade paved the way for colonialism in several ways. It integrated the economy in several African peoples into that of the Americas and Europe, and thus into a capitalist world economy dominated by Western Europe. The overall result was underdevelopment. The legacy of wars ensured that Africans could not unite to protect their interests in the way that Europeans were able to coordinate their plans for the partition of Africa at the Congress of Berlin. Scholars like Guyana's Walter Rodney, in his 1972 classic How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, have also shown how European powers created the economic dependence of the periphery on the metropolitan core in order to perfect the system of colonial rule in the Caribbean and the Americas during 2 centuries of imperial slavery before formally applying it to Africa for a century. European plantation owners in the Caribbean and the Americas used their wealth to increase consumer demand at home, which in turn fostered greater economic activity in the metropolis. Walter Rodney, who taught at the University of Dar es Salaam in Julius Nyerere's Tanzania, traced the roots of African underdevelopment to the 1884-1885 curse of Berlin, which is something that you were speaking about before. I'm skipping ahead so that we bring in a very scary name that I think Cape Townians are very used to. Cecil John Rhodes. Ceci for short. I like calling him Ceci. Africa was notoriously declared as res nullius, or a no man's land, conquered by brutal European imperialists, such as Britain's Cecil John Rhodes and Belgium's King Leopold II. The Scottish missionary explorer David Livingstone described colonialism in the apparently benign terms of the 3 C's: commerce, Christianity, and civilization. The more malign 3 P's may in fact have been more accurate: profit, plunder, and prestige. I really love this reframing, and also the ways in which the church was so deeply central and continues to be such a specter of control and domination, specifically when I'm thinking about African women, Black women, and specifically when I'm thinking about Black gender non-conforming and sexually deviant, deemed sexually deviant, marginal communities to which I belong. In light of that, and especially when we're thinking about the specters of mass death that we're seeing, I'm thinking about genocide in the Congo, thinking about Sudan specifically, and legacies, old, still contested legacies, like Germany's history in Namibia with the Nama and the Herero, and the ways in which that set the stage and is still setting the stage to what we're seeing in Palestine, for example, and the deep Holocaust denialism and twisting that's happening in Berlin to this day, like right now. Berlin is a very scary place to witness. And loves that I have, we've been discussing, very often we return to Namibia as a site of haunting of the European conscious. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, I know it's a meaty question, but to think about colonialism's link to the necropolitical present, and what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks. I mean, the genocide in Namibia is absolutely seminal. It's a very important event. And people like David Olusoga, the Nigerian Briton, have written very intelligently and insightfully about it. But it's always worth unpacking the details, because this was the dress rehearsal to the Nazi Holocaust 3 decades later, much as many people want to deny it or don't want to find the link. But this was the first genocide of the 20th century, whether we like it or not. So 80% of Herero and 50% of Nama were destroyed after they rose up to try to challenge the stealing of their land and cattle by German settlers between 1904 and 1908. And many of them were marched off to concentration camps, and this was also the origins of the concentration camps we saw later, at least in the Nazi context or in the German context. And they were basically, tortured. Experiments were carried out with their skulls, which was carried off to museums in Germany. Many of them have still not come back to the continent now. And I don't think you can separate that incident or the 10 million people that Adam Hochschild wrote in his book, that King Leopold's rapacious and brutal rule killed in the Belgian Congo. It was about half of the population at that time. And then the country ends up at independence with less than 100 university graduates. And you wonder why the Congo, a country the size of Western Europe, is having so many problems. It can't just be as simple as these blacks can't rule themselves. We have to locate all of these explanations in these historical accounts. And so that's why it's so important to make these links, in my view.
Absolutely. I think I also want to speak about the ways, we've heard Hegel come up and Descartes come up, and I know, Dr. Bibi, in your work, you push back against determinism, and you push back against dualism, and you push back against a lot of these legacies from a colonial period that we're still struggling with, and the ways in which it haunts, it even haunts African feminism in the way that we thought. So just before we open, because I'm looking up at the time and I'm like, wow, this chat has been so thick. I know that we can go on for ages, but I didn't want to open up into questions before. I wanted to ask about your specific thoughts about colonialism's haunting, the ghost of colonialism on African feminism, and how the deep specters of European thought still filter into the ways that we are trying to determine and think about our identities, separate, if such a thing could even be possible, but separate from these legacies of thought.
I think it's going to be always difficult to delink ourselves from these kinds of legacies. We are schooled in a university setting that requires certain types of citations that we have to make. And so we can either decide we want to make citations that would reference our people and do the groundwork of going into the archives. And sometimes when we do go into the archive, we might have to use the archives that's been created by the very people who are saying all kinds of crazy stuff about us, right? But it's how we're reading with the archive and reading against the archive. So I'm always thinking about, from a kind of, if you think about from a Nietzschean perspective, what is a usable sense of history that we want to hold on to, right? And to think, is this useful for us? As a true Yoruba girl, where we think, is this useful? If it's useful, come in. If it's not, discard, right? So my issue about the colonialism or coloniality of thought that might impinge on African feminist or Black feminist text is something that we have to continually wrestle with. The fact that on this panel, I have named mostly men, right? I'm very conscious about the fact that some of the language, the words that are inside my head are very masculine. I'm always asking myself and writers, who lives in your head? I know who lives in my head, and I know who I'm trying to fight against as they're living in my head, and they're living too much rent-free in my head, right? So it's how do I wrestle with that? With the full knowledge and understanding that this is what I have right now, and what am I using? How am I working with them? And the ways in which I think about some of these things is when I'm engaging with certain European philosophers, for example, I realize my entry point to them is usually because of my Yoruba-ness, because of my entry point through Yoruba. Yoruba gives me access to them. It's not the other way around. My access to a Merleau-Ponty, it's not through them per se. It's because I am accessing a particular Yoruba philosophical worldview that's allowing the European philosophers to become legible to me, right? So it's how I feel like a Gilroy sense of the Black Atlantic, of here we are in the best position as African or Black women. This is the best time in the world to be us, right? And we can take all the information, all the ideas circulating in the world, both from the likes of Prof here. We can pick Audre Lorde as our ancestor. We can pick Alice Walker, as problematic as she may be. We can we can pick from everywhere, right? And also understand that we have troubling ancestors, right? That we have to embrace.
Yeah.
And we also have to know that sometimes we need to give them a rest.
Yes.
So they don't come in too much and cloud our brains, right? Because I know that when I think of family members who are no longer with us, that I don't want that ancestors to come in right now. When I'm in my fighting mode, then I think, please come. But so we have to really be ready to choose the ancestors at different times. And sometimes those ancestors might be European ancestors who are deeply problematic, but they have certain uses, and we have to make use of them.
Absolutely.
And this is what reparation is also about,
yes,
as well. We have to repair, right?
Yes.
And we have to repair from the ruins.
Definitely.
As well.
in my head, as you were speaking, I was realizing how often figures like Simone de Beauvoir and Bessie Head have conversations about phenomenology in my head and argue in themselves, and it's beautiful just to have them argue in my brain and my body and my heart, and to call on them as ancestors of thinking. I'm super aware also that we have the last 10 minutes and we haven't opened into our beautiful audience, and I'd love to hear from you too. So if our ushers also could get anybody, if you have thoughts and such, I'd love to hear questions from the audience for the last 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. This was such a rich conversation and discussion. And I'm Congolese, so the question of thinking about the ways in which slavery and colonialism and the Berlin Conference haunt our current temporality is always top of mind. But I was thinking about this question, or the idea of the Black diaspora, and how so much of the ways in which we connect with each other is mediated through technology now, especially I think for millennials, etc. And I wonder what you think about how we negotiate questions of solidarity, complicity, identity, with the knowledge that these technologies are powered by extractive, violent labor.
I think we can grab a couple of questions and then talk right until the end. So, yes, we have a question over here, and we have one over there. Also, I see one here. We're going to have this one, and then I'll come to you. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, I want to start by declaring my ancestral intellectual knowledge to Professor Roch Ajulu, a much respected political economist. And it's lovely to hear Walter Rodney, Paul Gilroy coming up in this conversation. And something that struck me, just in terms of the panel with Bibi Bakare-Yusuf's clear African feminism, the world of African political economy, the lineage there is particularly male. So I was actually surprised to hear Alice Walker, Maya Angelou. And so I'm curious about processes that Professor Adebajo might be involved in, and the inclusion of women. And I don't mean inclusion as in we have an all-male panel, let's find a woman, or we have an all-white panel, let's find a black person. I mean really digging deep, engaging, understanding where are the women and how do we write them in as opposed to continue to silence. Thanks.
Fantastic question. And this one will be the last one, then I'll give you an opportunity to respond.
Thank you for an outstanding presentation of a very necessary topic of reassessing, reinterpreting, re-knowing who we are. I think the starting point really is the word history. What about her story, their story, our story? Who wrote it? How do we reinterpret it? And I think this is a time when we do need to do it, and also even using text, you're really talking, as we all are here, in English. So all those filters need to be addressed, and I think we're in an age where that can be done, in fact, must be done. And thank you to both of you, Professor Doctor, for making us rethink and for the outstanding questions, to make us realize where the stories are coming from, and hopefully where they're going.
And so much of that work is already happening, which is really beautiful and reassuring to remember. I'll give our panelists a little bit of a moment just to gather and a chance to respond in any order that seems okay.
I just want to respond to the question of our engagement and conversations across spaces and time, and which are being mediated by technologies and technologies of violence, right? I think I always say, if we understand that civilization is built on two things, at least from my perspective, on violence and excesses of the imagination, you need people who have real far-reaching imagination to say, I'm going to build the pyramid to bury my dead. I'm going to build the Taj Mahal to mourn my love, right? It's an excess of the imagination. But in order for those buildings to be made, bodies would have died, violence, and in another century we go there in tropes and celebrate and think about the wonders. So it's constantly wrestling with that, with the specter of death that always haunt any progress. It's always there. But the specter of death that's haunting Congo, for example, for us to be able to have those lithium and the technology, these are unnecessary deaths. These are the ways in which black bodies are casualized as always already dead. The necropolitics of black lives. And those kinds of death we have to resist and we have to refute them at all cost. We can extract without it creating so much. It is the excess of it that is the problem. So that's what I want to say about Congo. And thank you for the question.
Thanks. Just a couple of observations. The first is, one thing we did in this book, and I'm surprised it didn't come up today, the widespread rape of black women during slavery is absolutely fundamental to much of how black sexuality is looked at in the US today. You know, there were also Caribbean plantation owners who recorded in enormously grotesque detail their constant rapes of black women. Some of these narratives are now coming out. That was one of the things that I think we tried to bring out in this book as much as we could. And I think it's also important when we talk about how the past has shaped the present, because that's one of the most ubiquitous and strange incidents that happened throughout the time of slavery, including the so-called founding fathers in America, who are still put up on this pedestal. So I think that's important to note. What we tried to do, not so much with this book, but the Pan-African Pantheon that I referred to earlier in 2020, a lot of the pioneers of Pan-Africanism were men. We can't get away from that. But there were also people like Amy Ashwood Garvey who played such a fundamental role. Much of the journal that the United Negro Association was publishing, and much of that activism was also due to her. Another figure I think is important, we unfortunately did not have in the book, is Alice Kinloch, who is a black South African woman who actually organized that first Pan-African conference in 1900 in London with Henry Sylvester Williams. But it's the Trinidadian man that gets all the credit. And I think that is a challenge for all of us scholars, to try to dig up and write some of those histories. But the people we were able to at least, write up also included, I mentioned Maya already, but also writers like Buchi Emecheta and Mariam Abba, who I think were really phenomenal figures in that, post-independence generation of writers. So I take the point, and I think there's a lot of work to do. Just the last comment on history versus her story, I completely agree. And, in my own field of international relations and conflict resolution, security studies, there are younger scholars now, Canadian and others, who are really challenging the Eurocentrism in the field. And they're not pulling any punches with these, older white men. And I think, and it's done in a very empirical and a very fact-based way. And I think that kind of thing is very important as well, that we continue to not just talk about the reform of the curriculum, because in your Rhodes Must Fall 10-year anniversary, it's very important that you question how much has the curriculum really changed? Because when I go and teach and I see even the curriculum of black professors, it hasn't changed very much at all.
There is so much work to be done. Thank you so much. I am so deeply grateful to you, Professor and Dr. Bibi, for spending the last hour charting such a giant conversation. I know we could talk more and more. And thank you to everyone. And thank you for supporting the festival. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a fantastic festival.
Thank you.
Thank you.